What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I'm actively thinking about AI, thinking in AI. Okay, 3, 2, 1. What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how we're actively thinking in AI and how we're designing Killer Chaos OS for scale. Like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and how we're scaling those mental models into the future. Also just to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, to basically be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure off of that. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission that understand what it is that we're actively striving for, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So strategic breakdown of how I am integrating AI before the first line of code. So this is basically how I'm actively thinking in AI and actively solving AI, and how we're actively integrating AI into Killer Chaos OS, how I'm thinking about it, and the strategies that we have in play for it. So number one, which is start with mental models, not models. Ultimately saying, hey, AI is in the future, isn't a feature, it's an assistant that thinks in second order effects, ultimately as a COO with superpowers. Ultimately saying, hey, you need to view AI, or reviewing AI, as a not as a feature but ultimately as an assistant that thinks to second order, ultimately having a assistant with superpowers. So we're not just looking at it as a feature based thing that we're going to be integrating. We're looking at it and saying, hey, how can we actively have this assistant that's ultimately going to supercharge what it is that we're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and ultimately allow us to then have a multiplier effect, which basically multiplies the output that we have, and also just allows us to focus on higher leverage work. And saying, hey, how we're actively thinking about this is every alert, prediction, and insight must answer the following question, which is, what would a 10K per month ops manager do right now? And ultimately solve for that, to ultimately say, hey, are they doing manual inputs that are constantly taking a lot of their time? Okay, cool. This is what's going on. How do we now build a solution? And is it solving for that? Ultimately having that supercharged assistant that is ultimately building around that and saying, hey, every alert, every prediction, every insight ultimately needs to do what an ops manager would do, but at a level much higher, and ultimately allows us to multiply our effects in that. And saying, hey, our play, or my play that I ultimately have, which is, before you build AI, design with clarity of roles, ultimately assigning clarity of roles in terms of what it is that it's exactly going to do, and ultimately understanding that hey, we need to make sure that clarity is at the forefront of what it is that we're building for this and what we're solving as well. And this is just how we're actively thinking about this, to say, hey, before we build any feature, we need to make sure that we have clarity on, in terms of the roles, what it is that it's actually doing. And also saying, hey, don't just plug it in with tools, just ask. Ultimately saying, hey, don't just plug in tools and not know what is going on, what function it's actually serving. You need to make sure that, hey, we understand the decisions that it's going to be taking, and are those decisions high level, which need to be accurate, and ultimately then deciding that, hey, are the decisions that we're handing off or giving to this AI model that we're actively building, is it something that really needs our critical input and needs validation? Because sometimes it may get it wrong, and ultimately we don't want to be in a place where we make a blunder and ultimately give it high leverage tasks, which ultimately needs that human touch. And ultimately just understanding that, hey, we need to ask the question of saying, hey, what decisions does this AI help replace? Ultimately asking the questions of, what decisions within our internal infrastructure does it ultimately replace that we are actively doing in this present moment in time, and how crucial are those to our daily operations, and actively just building off of that. And saying, hey, let's ask a key question, which is, what's the thinking loop your AI needs to own? Ultimately thinking in models and saying, hey, what is the thinking loop that it needs to work? So for example, let's say, hey, we're first principles based, then we train, and then we say, hey, you need to make sure that our AI that we're integrating in terms of prediction, detection, and also just insights must also just follow that same premise. And saying, hey, we need to make sure that whatever premise it does use, we're ultimately using first principles and learning off of that by using models. And I think it's super important, the way that we're thinking about it, to just focus in on thinking in mental models, because I think thinking in mental models right now is super super important, because once we understand the mental models that we're working with, we basically then understand how it's going to react into the future, and we can actively solve around that, which ultimately moves to the second point, which is build a data nervous system, not just a dashboard. And ultimately saying, hey, you can't run AI if your data is dead. Ultimately understanding that, hey, we need to make sure that our data is not dead, our data is accurate, and we know what our data is doing, and we can actively use those data points that we have, and ultimately understand that we need to detect, or we need to predict, or just have insights that have a high level of accuracy, and ultimately just making sure that our data is as good as it possibly can be. So saying, hey, how we're actively thinking about this is saying, hey, we're mapping a planner's chaos in 4 categories, basically defining it in 4 separate categories, and saying, hey, we have time leaks, we have vendor risks, we have guest friction, we have delivery gaps. Ultimately understanding that with each metric it ultimately feeds into the living system, and that living system needs to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible, and that data is not dead, because once that data is dead, it ultimately is not usable. And we ultimately just categorize it within these 4 main pillars on saying, hey, is it a time leaks result? Is it a time leaks? Is it resulting to time leaks? Is it resulting to vendor risk? Or is it resulting to guest friction? Or is it resulting to delivery gaps? And ultimately just understanding that and saying, hey, an example of this could be, hey, let's say a planner misses 2 vendor replies. Ultimately, the AI then triggers and then says, hey, high ghost risk. Ultimately, just saying, hey, this is a high ghost risk based off of the 2 missed messages, and ultimately says, hey, we need to make sure that we escalate it to a backup vendor, and then prompts that, and ultimately saying, hey, how are we actively thinking about this? We need to make sure that, hey, we're actively thinking in all aspects and building that nervous system, and ultimately understanding that data is so crucial in what it is that we're building, and ultimately understanding that and saying, hey, your play or my play that I actively want to implement and think about it in that sense is ultimately labeling your chaos. Ultimately understanding that, hey, we need to be able to label our chaos into 4 different buckets, and ultimately feed it into Airtable, Notion, or Xano. Ultimately understanding where we're plugging our data sources, because once we understand our source of truth, where our source of truth is, we can ultimately just feed from that, and ultimately allow it to push into our other aspects that we're pushing into in terms of building Killer Chaos OS, in terms of integrating AI as well, and saying, hey, make AI the interpreter, not the fixer. Ultimately being the cause of understanding that, hey, it needs to actively just interpretate the data that we have, and ultimately understand what it is that we're plugging into it, so that it ultimately can give us insights that will ultimately allow us to stop chaos at its core. And saying, hey, what is the key question that we could ask here, which is, what raw signals are hiding your biggest chaos patterns? Ultimately asking, what are the raw signals that are hiding our chaos hidden patterns, and asking, hey, we need to make sure that these patterns are blatant, and we're actively just understanding those patterns, because once we understand those patterns, we can then solve for them, which is super important. And then with the help of what we're integrating in terms of AI and how we're thinking about it, we'll ultimately then have a solution that interprets it in the most effective way. And then ultimately saying, hey, design prompts like systems, which is super important. I think designing these prompts such as systems is super important, because then it allows you to define what it is that you're actively seeking, and ultimately communicating it effectively, and saying, hey, you don't want conversations, you want a command center logic. So basically saying, hey, you want to make sure that you have a command center logic and not just a conversation, because a conversation, you don't get much insight from that. Yes, you may get insights, but what you're dealing with and what we're dealing with and what we're thinking about, we need a command center logic, which is higher level, and ultimately requires a lot more input and care as well, in terms of how we're handling the data from input to output, and also the process in between. And saying, hey, how we're thinking about this is we're embodying prompt chains like this. So we're actively just using these prompt chains. So saying, hey, if a guest is if a guest drop off is above X, suggest 3 interventions using past events as context, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're using our past events as context to ultimately help this AI understand that, hey, this is a risk and we need to make sure that this risk is sorted out, but we need 3 intervention strategies that we could implement so that we can solve this based off of the previous stuff that has happened in terms of the build, and ultimately use the context, because context is everything. Because once it understands the context, we ultimately then know that, hey, it understands XYZ happened, so now let's use this command chain in order to understand and solve this problem that we're having, based also off of the data. So many different moving parts that ultimately we need to think about and how we need to take into consideration in terms of how we're going to be integrating it, which is super difficult, but we're ultimately just going to figure that out. And we're going to make mistakes, that is super normal, but ultimately, as long as we keep pushing the needle forward and just figuring out what it is that we need to be doing on a day-to-day basis, I know we're going to get it right. And saying, hey, and also saying, hey, your play or my play that I actively like to use, which is write prompts like flowcharts, ultimately just writing prompts like flowcharts, which is super simple. You can say, hey, this is the desired output that I want, this is what's happening, and then this is the result of that output. Use previous context as a result for that, for the future prompts that you're going to be making as well, ultimately just adding context as well. And saying, hey, stack logic, add fallback rules, ultimately saying, hey, we're adding logic and fallback rules to this so that it ultimately just understands what it is that we needed to solve for. And saying, hey, treat GPT like a system node, not a chatbot, ultimately just having it as a system node that ultimately functions in a manner that ultimately gives you the result that we need to strive for. And saying, hey, what is the key question that we could have here, which is, are your prompts engineered to think like a strategist? Ultimately asking the question of, hey, is it actively thinking as a strategist rather than just a chatbot or a tool, ultimately allowing us to have that extra assistant that is supercharged and ultimately allows us to then scale our operations into the future, and also how we're building Killer Chaos OS. I think this is super important in every sense, to just ultimately just understand what this means, what we're actively solving for, because I know that into the future we're just gonna hit the nail in the wall and just constantly just keep pushing this product or what it is that we're doing forward, and with that we're gonna make tons of mistakes, and we're just gonna have to learn from those mistakes and own up to them, and ultimately say, hey, we're actively building, and that's okay. We're in the trenches. We're actively just building and perfecting the product and learning a lot more. And saying, hey, the fourth point, which is train on use cases, not just hype. Ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're training on use cases. We're not just building AI for planners. So ultimately saying, hey, at the end of the day, we're not just building AI for planners, we're building event specific intelligence for high stakes operators. Ultimately saying, hey, we're not just building AI for planners, we're just creating high stakes events intelligence, which is super different from just creating AI, because it's not just AI, it is a central nerve, a brain of itself that ultimately serves for high stakes operators. And ultimately saying, hey, how we're actively thinking about this is 500k events don't need a room of for fluff. Ultimately saying, hey, we're actively solving for this, and we're actively just making sure that they don't have fluff, that they are ultimately getting this intelligence system integrated into their daily workflow. And saying, hey, every AI insight must feel like it came from a real planner, ultimately adding that human touch, which is super important. I think each and everything that we built, we need to make sure that we're actively just implementing that human touch, because that human touch is ultimately just going to allow us to feel connected in terms of what it is that we're doing, because connection is everything. And ultimately, especially with people, just ultimately that level of connection ultimately bridges that trust. And we need a level of connection, in my own opinion, in everything that we do, that human touch. Even though there's AI integration and all these fancy things going on that we're building, we ultimately just need to make sure that we have some level of human touch in what it is that we're actively building and integrating in terms of our workflows. And also saying, hey, my game plan, or I'm actively doing this or thinking about this, which is skip how can AI help me, rather ask what's the cost of not solving this problem with AI. Basically saying, hey, what is the cost of not solving this problem with AI, and what are the stakes involved with not solving with AI, and integrating this. How can we better multiply our output and have that multiplier effect in what it is that we're integrating, and also thinking about it and saying, hey, key question, which is, where is AI a multiplier? Like I said, not just a novelty. Ultimately, having it as a multiplier effect in terms of what it is that we're building, I think is ultimately going to allow us to reach a new level of truth, a source of truth that will ultimately just allow us to build better and scale better into the future. And like I said, we're still figuring this out in terms of how we want to build it. We want to take super detailed care in terms of what it is that we're going to be doing in terms of integrating this. And what this means is basically saying, hey, we're designing Killer Chaos OS like this. So basically saying, hey, we're having a data layer that basically structures XYZ. We're having ops logic, mental models, SOPs, and triggers. And then we have AI layers, reasoning, prediction, escalation, and these things. And then we have output layer, which is suggestions, automations, red flags, and dashboards. And that is how we're actively just thinking about this, and also just the strategies that we have in place, and saying, hey, we don't want another AI tool. We want to teach it how to think like us, but at its best. And ultimately allowing us to ultimately bridge the gap and just ultimately solve problems, which is the number one thing that I am super bullish on, just solving problems each and every single day. And with that means a lot of mistakes, means a lot of learning, and ultimately we are prepared for that, and we just need to keep hitting the nail in the wall and just constantly just keep pushing our boundaries forward of what we think is possible, what we think is impossible today, and ultimately create a new reality of possibilities tomorrow. And just ultimately just keep pushing the nail forward, and ultimately just understand. I know this is a mouthful, and I know into the future I'll speak more on this with more clarity and more precision. But yeah, this is just a rough explanation of how we're actively thinking about this, how I'm actively thinking about this in particular, and how I plan on solving for this, and ultimately just learning as well, which is super important. So yeah, if you guys want to connect with me, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, YouTube as well. Leave a comment if you guys have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next video.